Hi there, my name's Dr. Caspar Melville. I teach at SOAS in the School of Arts. I convene an MA in Global Creative and Cultural Industries and teach the Music Business course. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about the issues of how we might think about record collecting as a form of curation. What's going on in relation to, collecting records? How can we what kind of perspectives can we bring to our understanding of it? And so I'm going to introduce you to a couple of ideas from the cultural theorist Will Straw, some of the readings that I gave you, one about the issue of gender and connoisseurship, and the other one about the musical commodity and material culture. And then I just want to kind of road test some of these ideas, but also by sort of talking about my own practice as a record collector. I've got a couple of records here that I just want to bring out and just have a sort of broad think about the ways in which we can imagine record collecting as an act of curation and some of the sort of theoretical coordinates of such an understanding. So the first thing is really to introduce Will Straw's ideas here. The first set of ideas which he raises in this piece, which is called music as commodity culture, music as commodity and material culture, is around the nature of the cultural commodity. Now, what kind of thing is it? He looks at a variety of different perspectives and considers really what happens. What he's interested in is the life cycle of the commodity. This is related to Abderrahman's idea about the social life of things, inquiring into the life that things have and the journeys that they take. And one of the points he makes is about the way in which a commodity has a certain kind of value when it's first produced. He queries whether we should think about it in terms of use value. What is it for us? And obviously, he distinguishes between the nature of the musical commodity and the nature of other kinds of commodities in terms of how you buy them. No matter how much you like an album, he says, you might love the Blur's album, but you're not only going to buy one of them. I mean, you might buy one on CD and one on vinyl, you might buy a special edition, but fundamentally, once you've made the decision to buy it, you've got it, and you're not going to buy another one. Unlike, for example, a chocolate bar, which you're going to have a loyalty to a Mars bar or whatnot, and you're going to continue buying it and consuming it. So there's something specific about the nature of a cultural commodity. Another thing that's specific about it is the way in which we don't really know if it's going to be successful. No matter how hard cultural producers and the companies that produce commodities try, the items they're producing, the cultural commodities they're producing, are risky to produce because you never really know if the audience are going to want to buy them. They don't have to buy them because they're not necessities. Unlike, loaves of bread and toilet paper. So you have to try and distinguish them in the market. You have to make them attractive. There is an element of desire about people wanting to acquire them. But once they've acquired them, what happens to them? Are they then effectively dead? Because as a commodity, their job is to be bought and sold and consumed. And once that's happened, Will Straw is very interested in the kind of afterlife of the cultural commodity. What happens when that cultural commodity has ceased to have the value which is given to it in a particular space, conferred by it being new and it being fashionable. And that's why he goes on to talk about things like secondhand record shops. What's really happening there? And then also, as collectors, what are people doing when they collect? What is the kind of psychology of collecting? And can we imagine there's something more going on than merely the kind of accrual of dead cultural objects? At one point, he kind of talks about secondhand record shops and charity shops where you could be surrounded by secondhand vinyl as kind of museums of failure. But he wants to think a bit harder about that and think about what that might entail. So that's one set of considerations, the nature of the cultural commodity, especially after it's passed through the cycle of consumption, the first round of the cycle of consumption. What happens then? Where do they end up? How are they valued? And who are the people doing the valuing here? And of course, this is where the role of the collector comes in, and in particular, the role of the collector as a kind of curator. What is a collector doing when they accrue often discarded cultural objects? And one of the issues that he kind of raises, one of the possibilities, is that there's something about the way in which cultural commodities mark time, which allows us to convey precise and fleeting moments in cultural history through our acts of collection. There's something about the way that you can preserve, almost freeze time that things seen in retrospect, outside of the cycles of sort of fashion and newness, you know, what he calls neophilia, the kind of what he considers to be one of the underlying sort of psychological desires of collecting is this so-called neophilia. I want new stuff. I want the new things. Lies the idea that you, through acts of sort of personal creation, which are also public in a way, because people who collect records display them in certain contexts. You know, they on the one hand, they're domesticating them. They're taking cultural objects out of kind of capitalist circulation and domesticating them, bringing them home. You know, record collectors keep their records at home. But there are elements of display. You know, you display your records in certain ways that people who come around to your house can see them. I mean, my records are in the front room downstairs. Anyone who visits my house will see them on the shelf, and that's obviously a deliberate move. I mean, it's where the space is, but they could be in a box room at the back. It's controversial because it clashes with my partner's, you know, aesthetics and idea of what should be on display. But there's clearly a display element there. And then, of course, there are other ways in which collectors display their knowledge and their collections. You know, you could have a radio show. You can make mixtapes, or what used to be called mixtapes, or selections of records. And of course, you also display it through your knowledge in a kind of economy of expertise and connoisseurship. So I want to hold on to that idea that there's something about collecting records which might be about trying to sort of hold on or recover or rescue art from the flow of kind of the cultural commodities, which is, you know, which is about capitalism, and which is about trying to buy and sell things, and which has got a built-in obsolescence to it, and to organize the world, to impose a degree of order or understanding, or to generate knowledge about the world through the way that we read those cultural texts. So that's one set of questions. And the other set that Will Straw raises in the other essay is about the way in which connoisseurship, which underpins collection, is gendered. He makes the argument that, you know, collecting, and record collecting perhaps more than any other forms of collecting, is a kind of masculine a pastime. It is dominated by certain kinds of masculine codes. It tends to be a boy's thing. It tends to be about what he calls homosocial information mongering. You know, and here you might think about the way in which male collecting cultures spend a lot of time swapping expertise, often about numbers. You know, I mean, traditionally, you know, the train spotter is interested in spotting all the trains and writing down all the numbers, and the train spotter is, you know, not that women don't train spot, I'm sure some do, but it's a sort of almost paradigmatic masculine activity. So he talks about the homosocial information mongering, which he calls one of the underpinnings of masculine power. The way, the sort of putting into play your expertise around very sort of specific forms of knowledge. He talks about two kind of masculine paradigms which seem to predominate in this world. And one is the hipster, and the other one is the nerd. The hipster knows how to sort of curate themselves and curate their own kind of cultural knowledge as a way to display it in the public realm, and makes the knowledge subordinate to their own kind of cultural competence in a way. And, you know, they disavow huge amount of expertise to show how they swim very easily in the flows of whatever is cool and interesting. On the other hand, the nerd, who's got social deficits, is obsessed with the detail about, you know, the catalogue numbers of the records, for example. It's very common in record collecting circles that people will start brandishing catalogue numbers around of obscure things, or you need to know the name of the record label in order to participate in the kind of discussions which go around that sort of thing. So he's considering whether there is something sort of deeply masculine about record collecting, and whether there are processes which actually exclude women from the act of collecting. And so, I mean, here's a quote from him. "It's often in his relationship to his collections that the male's idea about his domestic stability or the organization of the domestic environment find their fullest elaboration." You know, he mentions the kind of disheveled bachelor flat where, you know, everything's topsy-turvy, but the record collection is, you know, pristine in the corner. And, you know, so there is this intimate relationship between the domestic and the world outside, around issues around gender, and issues around the relationship between what he calls the exhausted commodity. Once the commodity has passed through the loops of kind of conventional capitalism, what happens to it? Where does it go? And who's it picked up by? And one of the answers to that question is that it's picked up by record collectors, people like me. I think I'm I don't know, in some sense, I'm a typical example of a product of my environment. The kind of music I like and value is the kind of music that was given value in the subcultural circuits that I, moved in London in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. But in other ways, I think I've got an idiosyncratic way of collecting. I'm not a completist. I'm not the kind of person that wants every single record that was made by, a given artist, although I do have some artists who I have a lot of their records. But I think what I've done in my sort of life of collecting records, which I've been doing now for 30 odd years, and I don't have a huge collection. I mean, perhaps, 5,000 records or something like that. 45s, 12 inches, albums, compilations. That's how they're divided up. I think that there are some, in going through some of the records I'm going to show you and sort of thinking about them, I'm just going to think about the variety of different kinds of information, the variety that you can glean from a record, what I value, what the kinds of motivations that I followed, and see if they kind of fit a little bit with the arguments that Will Straw has been making. Okay. So let me start with showing you a record. Okay. So this is Duke Pearson's The Phantom. It's a Blue Note record from, let's see if I can find out what year it's from. It's not always easy when you look at record sleeves. I can't see the year, but I'm going to speculate and say that it's probably 1969, 1970. On the Blue Note label, it's a kind of funky jazz album, kind of funky spiritual jazz, with a marvelous band. You can see, I don't know if you'll be familiar with any of these players, but a lot of them are very well-known. Mickey Roker on the drums and Bob Cranshaw on the bass, fantastic jazz rhythm section, Duke Pearson playing the piano. So this is a kind of example of like a classic sort of record that one would buy. Because why would I buy it? Well, it presupposes a certain kind of knowledge, because you need to know when you go into a record store, or especially a thrift store, or a junk shop where you can find a lot of records, you need to have some kind of knowledge that you can deploy to understand why you might invest in a record. But you're getting all kinds of information. So the first kind of information you're getting, of course, is from the cover photograph. It's a beautiful photograph. It's of a black woman with an afro. You're getting plenty of information here already. It's aesthetically pleasing, very nicely designed, great typeface, right? So it gives you a sense that it's a record of quality. The fact that it's a black woman gives you some indication of the kind of music to expect from that. It's going to be somewhere most likely in the realm of soul or funk or jazz. Then you've got the title, The Phantom, which is a nice kind of evocative title that feels like it might be edging towards something classy, right? And if you know anything about Blue Note Records, which you do, if you know about jazz, you will know about Blue Note Records, which is the dominant record label of the 1960s and 70s, which had an ethos of letting the musicians play tunes that they wanted to play, not just reproducing old standards. And in fact, it's true to say that of the tracks listed on here, they're all original numbers produced by the band. So this would be a record that I would have seen in a record store. Look, we've got some other information here. What does that tell us? Well, it says that it was $7.50, and that will tell you that I bought it in America. And I bought a lot of my records in America. And one of the reasons that I bought records in America was because I was after American music, but I didn't want to pay too much for it, to put it simply. And if a record like this in a British record store, if it was a record store that knew what they had, would be very expensive. Whereas here, $7.50 is not a great amount of money to invest. So it was well worth my time to get it. It's a beautiful cultural object. It gives you a sense of a certain time in history. It's the original album from that time, so there's an element of wanting to have the original thing. I would always buy an album like that. I love that record. And it's a record that I return to. I'm happy to have. I want to own it, and I want to put it in my collection. And this raises one of the interesting questions, which is about the psychology of wanting to own cultural objects rather than just consume them. I suppose it applies to art collectors, although of course the amount of money you need to collect art is much higher. What is the motivation? What's the psychological motivation? Well, I think for me, it's to do with wanting to have that piece of music, definitely. But it's more than that, because there are reasons why I'm looking for records at this time in my life. And that reason is to do with club culture. It's to do with the fact that there was a use value for this music, and that use value was about being able to dance to it. me, like a lot of people of my generation, aspired to be DJs or wanted to be DJs or were fascinated by the idea of being a DJ. You know, and they were the cultural curators of our day. They were curating their record collections, presenting them to us, people who've never heard this music, you know, and giving us a window into a whole different time in cultural history, which also felt incredibly relevant. You know, the music of 1960s and 1970s in Black America felt very relevant to 1980s London, which had similar issues around race and justice and, you know, the need for joy in a rather joyless life. So what we were looking for initially, and what I was looking for as a collector, wasn't actually any particular artist or any particular album. I wasn't really interested. I was in that level of completeness. I was interested in trying to find records that people could dance to. And that was obviously mediated by what kinds of dance people were able to do, what kinds of rhythms people wanted to dance to. And one of the huge influences on this in the period I'm talking about in the 1980s was hip hop, because hip hop was built on sampling the music from a previous generation, including those Blue Note albums, in particular Blue Note, and the music of James Brown and George Clinton and many others. And it was through that that people like me, started collecting music, partly out of the desire to find records that we could potentially play to people to dance to. So we had quite a clear sense of the use value of what we were after. It wasn't just about the aesthetic object, although that's lovely. It wasn't just about capturing, you know, the great playing on that record. It was about, have I got a tune that people might be able to dance to here, which I could potentially play in my DJ set? Because there's a very high value placed within DJing of playing music that other people have not heard, of discovering it for yourself. And that is a prime motivator and a prime, I suppose there's an element of kind of hipster in that, which is, you know, I've got the new and you don't have it. And DJs were notoriously very sort of jealous of the knowledge that they'd accrued, and often sometimes they'd even put little white discs over the record so that the audience couldn't see what they were playing. That knowledge had a value, a subcultural value in the marketplace. But it was a marketplace built around secondhand records, because this music had come out way before and had kind of, as Will Straw said, as a commodity, they were exhausted in a sense. And oftentimes they could be picked up in secondhand record stores, but they could be revalued. They could be placed in a new relationship to the contemporary, which is what hip hop was doing, making this stuff relevant to the contemporary world of the 1980s. So here's another record. Bernard Purdie, the great drummer. You might not know his work, although if you've ever heard the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, Staying Alive, and all those Bee Gees songs, he's playing the drums on that album. But this is an album that he produced. Again, it's not easy to tell what year it is. There's a kind of a bit of an art to finding out what year a record has come out in. Sometimes they list it on the bottom, but in Roman numerals. And if you don't know your Roman numerals, you won't know what year it is. Sometimes it's on the back cover, and sometimes it will be on the label itself. Let's have a look. Yeah, there we go, 1968. It's on the label. So that's a really important piece of information when you're buying records, because it helps you to place it within a certain kind of time. And if you know anything about the evolution of rhythm, especially in Black American music, rhythms change over time, and generic change will dictate often much about the aesthetics of the record. And so it's quite important to find out what period a record is from in order to figure out what it's likely to sound like. Because the point about this kind of consumption is that you buy it unseen. It is possible to go into a record shop and to have a record played for you before you buy it, but I never did that. And that, to do that for me, would have been to ruin the experience, because the experience was about going out somewhere and trying to discover something that you'd never heard before. So that led to two things. One is I generally didn't go out with a list of records that I'd heard on the radio or another DJ had played looking for them. I was looking for something new. And it wasn't just neophilia in the sense that something that I had not heard before, but something that I could discover for myself. And the most exciting moment in this was the period between purchasing the record, and of course there's a lot of anxiety that goes together with that process, because it might be expensive and you don't know if it's going to be any good. So there's an element of risk, which is also the element of gambling and the excitement of it. The most exciting bit is coming home from the record store with that new piece of vinyl that you've got no idea what it's going to sound like, and then listening to it and seeing if you've discovered something. So that element of discovery is absolutely key to my own collecting psychology. One of the things about this album is most of the tunes are horrible. I mean, they're corny, they are overly emphatic. You know, when a drummer makes an album, obviously the problem is there's too much drums in it. And what often happens in each track is you get a kind of the establishment of the groove and a bit of the melody, and then the drummer comes in bashing his drums, and he's a big, strong drummer, and kind of wailing away. So it's not actually that useful track by track, or I would never listen to it all the way through. It's just too much. But what's really valuable about it, what's really good about it, is that it has incredible breakbeats on it. I wish I had my record player here so I could play it to you. But for example, the first track, Soul Drums, it starts off with like a 1.5 minute drum solo, which is just so fat. You can feel, you know, I'm sure it's been sampled many times. And this was one of the things that people of my generation were keen to discover, was breakbeats, hidden elements of the song itself. So in this way, we're kind of disarticulating the cultural commodity. You know, we're taking it down from, you know, a new album that could be bought. That album then is bought by someone. And that's the point of both of these records. You know, they're pre-owned. Someone else owned them. I got them in secondhand record shops. So they've already had a life. And that life, that was the life cycle of the first phase of it as a commodity. It's then resold, but not for very much money. I mean, this one cost me £4 somewhere in, I think it was a record store in Brighton. You know, it's pretty bashed up, the cover, and it's quite scratched, the record. So it, in the sense of it being a pristine object, which for some people motivates their buying very much because they want something perfect, doesn't bother me at all. I like the crackle. I like the messed up cover. I like the fact it's gone through other people's hands, and that tells me something about the cycle of valuation. You know, this was a valuable thing to someone when it was originally produced, and that value then leaches away for a variety of reasons, and then it's put into another place, and then I get to hear it, and then I get to hear these breakbeats, and then I think, wow, I've got these brilliant breakbeats. If I ever become a hip-hop producer, I will sample those breakbeats. And it's a fantasy, of course. I'm not a hip-hop producer and never will be, but somehow there's something about the artifact of it, and the fact that I've found value, and me and many people like me find value in things which would be completely overlooked from another perspective. You know, from a musicological perspective, this is a collection of songs which are more or less good. From a kind of production perspective, it's an artwork which has been produced in a certain kind of way. From a design perspective, it's got a pretty cool cover. But what matters to me is the way that it contains within it little bits of information which have been completely overlooked and were probably not very much part of the initial economic calculation of why this would be produced in the first place. So that's Bernard Purdie. Let me just explore some other elements of my own psychology, just to sort of give you a hint. I mean, I don't know if I'm typical or not, but I just want to give you a hint in the kinds of decision making that's going in to my relationship with my records, which is an emotional relationship. It is wrapped up with my own sense of self. It's wrapped up with my own desire to project a certain kind of self into the world. It does have a gendered component. Most of the people in my life that I've spoken to about records, that I've been involved with in kind of swapping musical knowledge, have been men. And men have predominated in the popular music cultures that I'm describing. So there are ways in which women are kept out from that kind of knowledge economy. And that there is a rather masculine, because I think it's competitive as well. That's the thing about records and record shopping. It's not pleasant, actually, in my experience, because it's a deeply competitive environment. When you go into a record store, you are initially competing in a way with the people who are in that record store in terms of knowledge. Are you looking for the right stuff? Are you asking for the right stuff? Will Straw cites Nick Hornby's book, High Fidelity, about this kind of middle-aged man who runs a record store and the way that they scorn the customers for asking for the wrong kinds of music, right? So there's always the danger of kind of social shame that comes with entering a record store. It's a combative environment. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is it's competitive, because when you're in a record store and you go into a record store, and it's not unlike, if you can find one, or traditionally, historically, it's not unlike, you know, a pawn shop in a weird way. These are kind of strange cultural objects where there are hunched men, sometimes in raincoats, sort of rifling through them in a rather obsessive type of way. No one's really talking. Maybe the people in the shop are swapping specialist knowledge, which goes way over your head, and the people in the shop are thinking about, how can I join in this conversation in order to show my, you know, my credentials in terms of operating this kind of subcultural knowledge. And it's even competitive if you go in with your friends. That's what's weird. I always went record shopping on my own, because if you go with your friends who value the same kind of music that you value, you walk into a shop and immediately it's like, starter's pistol goes, who can find the right record? You know, there's rifling going on, there's people looking over what everyone else is finding. There's a real sense of competition about that built into the record collecting world, which I think is one of the aspects that makes it so masculine. And that issue that Will Straw mentions about masculinity in collecting reminds me of an interview that I did once with the reggae DJ dubplate Pearl Bosun, who grew up in West London. She's about my age now, and she's been collecting reggae records for a long time. But she told me a story of going into a record shop in the 70s, trying to buy the latest dub tune. She loved dub, and basically being ignored at the counter while all the men from the sound systems were being served. She was just ignored. And she said, even at one point, she said she remembers that one of the sound system men, turned to the person behind the counter and said, "Don't serve her. She's a woman. She's not even in the sound system." As if that knowledge had to be kept within the tight circuits of sort of masculine appreciation. It's taken her ages, and she's still struggling in some ways to kind of break through that barrier of gender when it comes to musical expertise. So let me show you another record. Now, this sort of points out, in a way, I'm just trying to think through my own bizarre responses to my own records and my own sort of interaction with them. So this is an album called Urban Classics, which was released in the 1980s with a selection of wonderful tunes from the sort of rare groove era, it was called in the UK, in the 1980s, when a lot of Black American music was being rediscovered. And it's been collected and put on this compilation. I love the tunes on this album, but I don't love this album. And one of the reasons I don't love it is it's pre-curated. It has taken the agency that I like to operate on records, which is to find and select music that I have never heard before, that maybe other people haven't, and tie my identity in with that. But this is just a pre-selected, right? This is like if you're a curator in an art gallery and you just took someone else's exhibition that they decided was the right kinds of things and stuck it on the wall. Well, in what way are you doing the curation then? Your agency has been undermined. So I don't really love this record. I'm happy I've got it. I've played it out. It's not particularly well produced either. One of the things about the history of the cultural industries, which is written across records, is the quality of the vinyl, how well it's been produced, how loudly. What you've got here is cheap, thin vinyl from the 1980s, when vinyl production became, record companies were trying to save money. It was actually after CDs had been invented in 82, and they became the dominant way in which music was recorded. So vinyl was on the out and wasn't treated that seriously. Too many tracks crammed in on the record. There isn't a relationship between how much space a track can have on the record and how loud it is, which is why 45s, which are a chunk of vinyl that wide with just one track on, can be much louder than records here, because the grooves can be deeper. So there's actually a physical, technological reason why, in terms of value, that I can see when I look at it, and I know that to be the case. But I also can't bring myself to love it because it's something that's been pre-selected for me, rather than something that I have intervened in myself. So it feels inauthentic in a way. And if I would play it out, I'd hide the cover, because I don't want people to think that, oh, he's just playing music that someone else has told him is good. That undermines my expertise, my sort of psychological sense that I'm the person that's done the compiling and done the selection and done the discovery. And that's a really important set of psychological kind of processes of the world, which of record collecting. Let me show you, just to sort of go on a bit about, reasons for choosing records that you don't know. Look at this. This is a Pointer Sisters album called Stepping from 1975. Now, that's a crucial year, 1975, because generally I've bought records which go up to 1975, 1976, and then I'm much more wary of my choices after that. And the simple reason for that is disco, because disco came in about 1976 in America and became hugely successful as a new dance form. It was faster, it was more upbeat, it was, you'll be familiar with what disco is. It was made by many of the same people who are making these kind of records, but it had a new feeling, and it was so predominant that it led many musicians, including jazz, soul, and funk musicians, to kind of move into this disco terrain, which was incredible. There was lots of good records made, but there were also an awful lot of bad records. It became such a huge fashion in the American industry, It kind of saved them at a period when rock music was kind of running out of steam and exhausting itself. But it became so ubiquitous and much of it very banal that you have to be really careful as a record buyer to try and buy your records from the period late enough in the 70s when the technology of recording was good enough. So they really learned how to record bass and drums really well, how to sort of boost the sound. And, you know, the musicianship is extraordinary because many of these musicians have been playing since the late 50s. But you have to be careful with the dates. So that's another way in which you're kind of, as you're making your decisions, you're kind of curating music periods. You're trying to understand how things fit together. You're thinking about genre. I mean, what did I know about this? I'd heard of the Pointer Sisters, of course, as a famous, you know, pop band, really. They had had several hits in the 1980s. But what becomes clear, and one of the great things about albums of this era, is that they list the musicians. And so you can spend some time reading about who's actually on the album. You can find out, is there a conga drummer, for example? If it's got conga drums or percussionists, you've got a sense of the kind of music you maybe are going to get. You can also tell it slightly from the song titles. I mean, generally on jazz and jazz funk albums, if there's a song title in Spanish, it means that there's a Latin flavored tune, you know, a sort of either Brazilian or Puerto Rican or Cuban feel to the music. And if you like that kind of thing, which I do, that gives you a good reason to buy it. But also here, who have you got playing on it? Herbie Hancock, Paul Jackson. Well, Herbie Hancock is the keyboard player who had played with Miles Davis and made many brilliant jazz funk albums in the 70s. Paul Jackson was the bass player in one of those bands, the Headhunters. So that tells me that even though I know this is a pop band, the music is likely to be the kind of music that I particularly value, you know, high grade jazz funk, which is really what I'm after. And I liked it because I didn't know the album at all. You know, I'm not interested in buying Pointer Sisters tunes, which everybody knows and has been in the charts. I'm interested in uncovering things which I didn't know. And then possibly sharing them with other people. Although, I mean, I suppose I have done in conversations with my friends, although I don't do that very much. It's almost like knowledge, which is I'm building into myself and my own understanding of the world. I mean, as Will Straw says, I'm turning a commodity, a potentially exhausted commodity. Again, it's secondhand. How much was this? $3.99 at the time, much less than it would have been when it was new. I'm turning it into knowledge. I'm reconstructing it and I'm rescuing it. You know, I feel that I've rescued this commodity. I've given it a final resting place, another issue that Straw mentions, a place where it's valued, where it's been removed from the circuits of capitalism and valued as an artifact, as a piece of material culture, and as a great work of art, which I think it is. Let me contrast that with another record. This is another Blue Note record. This is John Patton, the organist. This is a wonderful, wonderful record. It's basically a three-piece: drum, saxophone, and organ. Absolutely brilliant, wonderful typography, great photography by Francis Wolff, who, I think it's Francis Wolff who, well, in fact, he produced the album. He ran Blue Note Records. No, it is Francis Wolff. He took the photograph and produced the album and ran Blue Note Records. An amazing guy. It's a great documentary about Blue Note that I recommend to you. So on the one hand, I love this album and I love the music on this album, but I don't love it as much as the others. And here's a clue to why. It's got a barcode on it. What does that tell us? That tells us that this is a reissue which was produced in the 1980s or possibly even 1990s, at the period when, because of the mass rediscovery of Black American music from the earlier period, record companies started reissuing records. So while I love the music on this album, I don't feel emotionally as attached to it because it's not the original artifact. It's a subsequent version. And it's branded in a way. I feel that's a branding, which makes it to me, very different from this, which is the original record. Someone went into a record store and bought this brand new in 1975 and then played it many times, as you can tell from the scratches on it. And then somehow it ended up being discarded, which tells you something about the nature of consumer society, in particular American consumer society, which has a tendency to chuck out the past. You know, Americans are always moving house. They're always upping stakes and moving somewhere else, reinventing themselves. And they have a very fast turnover of cultural products and technology to play those products. So many people would have got rid of their record player and got rid of their records at the same time, discarded it. It no longer mattered to them or their identity work or the connoisseurship that went into it. But it then opens up a new terrain this terrain of the kind of afterlife of the thing, of the material, of the commodity. So much as I love this album, I suppose I'd much prefer if I could find the original version of it. So I've got it and I'll listen to it, but I feel differently about it. Let me just give you a couple more just for fun. Okay, so this record, there's Gene Khan. Gene Khan is a famous American soul singer. What I really like about this record is, and actually I don't like all the tracks on it. There's one track on it I really like, and the rest I don't like at all, and would never play, and I would find embarrassing, is how shabby it is. You know, there's several bits of information on here, which just suggests that there was a period at which it was valued because it was bought by someone, and then there was a period at which it was devalued, right? It wasn't, it was somehow tossed out. Now, the first thing to say here is this. Can you see this printed on there? Not for sale. A commodity that's not for sale. What's going on? Well, this tells you that, and clues you into some of the practices of the creative industries in terms of how you manage the risk of producing a record. What do you do when you produce a record? You want it to be widely heard. You send it to DJs or to radio stations and ask them to play it. So you make it a promotional copy or a demo. This says a demonstration copy. Weirdly, what it's demonstrating is itself, right? Because this is the finished article. As Will Straw says, you know, with a cultural product like music, you don't make a version of it, you know, a kind of rough draft and send it around, you know, to the public to see if they want to buy and invest in the final product. You have to make the final product in order to show them what it is it's going to be, right? But the fact that you have, and the fact that it gets heard before, does not devalue it. In fact, and he compares this to film. You know, if you've seen a film, you're not going to go and see it again, pretty much. You've seen it. But in relation to music, it's important to hear that music, or it has been important that the music is actually heard. You've experienced the commodity in its fullness. You've consumed it in order to then trigger you to go and buy it. Now, I have said that my buying sort of psychology has been slightly different from that, that I want to buy music I haven't heard before. I don't know if that's an idiosyncrasy of myself or it's another version of the collector-curator relationship. The other thing about the devaluation is you can see that this ended up in a charity shop, 75 cents, look, and someone has scribbled it on both sides. So someone has been so careless about this as a cultural commodity that they've scribbled the price in pen right on the front there, arguably spoiling it. But for me, it doesn't spoil it. It adds another layer of kind of history to it. So this is something that's gone from from being given away to a promotional outlet, probably a radio station, who for a while might have had it and played it. It then went out of fashion and they chucked it away. It then went to God knows where, but maybe a secondhand record store, and then eventually to Goodwill, which is American charity shop. What else can we find about this? The record label tells us that it's on South Soul Records, which is a very, Philadelphia International, not South Soul, a very great soul record label from Philadelphia. Gamble and Huff were the key sort of producers in that. So that piece of information alone that is on that label tells me something about what I'm going to get from this. I'm not that familiar with the musicians, so that didn't really help. But because of the image of Gene Khan and because of how they've presented to me, I've got a feeling of what kind of genre it's going to be in. And anyway, it's absolutely worth the risk because it's only going to cost me 75 cents. And I love the sort of unloved nature of this cultural commodity. It does, in some ways, it's been exhausted, it's been denigrated, it's been discarded, but it's always there to be revalued and rearticulated and placed back into a kind of new story of that period, which is part of the reason that I'm motivated to have it and to love it. And I often revisit these records. I mean, usually with nearly all the tracks, the records I've shown you so far, I'm interested in one or two of the tunes on the album, rather than the album as a whole artistic work. And that's partly to do with the way the album operates differently within sort of soul, funk, jazz than it does in rock music, where it's much more likely the album is a kind of total artwork, a kind of concept album, you know, which you're meant to listen to from the beginning to the end. I never listen like that. I listen on a record player, I skip through tracks. But one thing that does offer you is the chance to go back to these records again and again and go and listen to those tracks that you overlooked at the time. And one thing I've been doing during COVID, for example, is going back and listening to my records, not to the dance floor tracks, because there are no dance floors to play to, but to the slower ones, the more Latin-y ones, the more African ones, the ones that are more non-traditional in terms of the 4/4 beat, which dominates in club culture. So it's given me access to a whole new set of things, which I've owned for 30 years, but I've never listened to or valued. And so there's a continual revaluation of the cultural object, which is not about it being a commodity anymore, because all of the financial transactions around it have ceased, unless I decide to sell it to someone else. But in fact, it's got no value because it's an old album. It's not in great condition. You know, it's really difficult to resell that. Let me finish up with one more thing, thinking about record collecting as curating. And this is an album called, I think it's called Salomao, which is the new Dave Pike set featuring the Grupo by Afro in Bahia, right? And as you can see from the image here, what you have got is a group of white musicians, some from America and some from Germany, playing with a group of Brazilian musicians, many of whom are percussionists, but not all. You've got a musical fusion going on. Here are the tracks, an amazing collection of tracks, I think. Not traditional dance music by any means. It's improvised. There are copious liner notes. This, to me, is the kind of epitome of the cultural object after it's passed through the cycles of capitalism and commodification. In the one sense, it's exhausted. In another sense, it's so alive. It's a wonderful object. It's wonderfully designed. It's challenging. It gives you a sense of what was happening in the musical world between jazz musicians and in America and outside. This was a period when, you know, European jazz had many years to evolve, partly through the way that they collaborated with American musicians who were fleeing, you know, American racism. People like Don Cherry, Miles Davis, coming to the UK, coming to Europe, Paris, the Netherlands, Germany. And so you've got German jazz musicians playing with Dave Pike, a white American jazz musician, playing with Brazilians and exploring the interface between these different musical traditions, which are different, but on the other hand, are all part of an Afro-diasporic musical tradition, which has been circulating around the world, you know, since the dawn of the Atlantic slave trade. And this is a cultural object of great value to me. I don't know if it's got great value on the market, although I could probably look it up, and it probably has in a way. It's the original album. It's in good condition. It tells a fascinating story. It's a piece of knowledge. It's a bit like having a book on the shelf, and yet you can listen to it and you can dance to it. And in that way, I do feel that as a record collector, I am doing something very similar to what a curator does, but in different kinds of spaces and places. So obviously there's a domestic component to what I'm doing, which is not the case with the curator who's putting on an exhibition, although of course they might be collectors as well. They have intimate relationships with artists. They get to know a particular field very well, and they are trusted to be the person who selects from that field in order to present to an audience. And that's what I do if I do a radio show or if I DJ at a club or a party. I am making a selection out of what I've already selected, which has been selected partly from the cultural ephemera of a capitalist commodity system, which has gone through its cycle, and the excess of that cycle are these cultural objects which are both devalued according to, you know, the conventional way to value culture. It's not brand new, it's old-fashioned, it's already been bought and discarded. You know, what value is in it? But the curator role is the person who gets a chance to revalue those cultural commodities and represent them. It's not a field which is completely innocent, as Will Straw has talked about, in terms of its gendering, in terms of the way it sort of props up a certain kind of male expertise. So research in this area could go in a lot of different directions, but one of them, of course, is to talk to female record collectors, and there are now many more female DJs in the club culture. So obviously, you know, record collecting is not specific to any given gender or race, but has acquired these kind of gendered values. But it also allows us to think about the life cycle of the cultural commodity and the afterlife of the cultural commodity, and under what conditions we can rescue cultural objects and art from entrapment within the commodity system and free them in some way through our interaction with them, through our understanding and knowledge about them, and through the way we present that into the world. It makes the curation role in music a very sort of rich area of study and also of activity. So I hope that that has been helpful for you in terms of, you know, simply thinking about the record collector as some kind of curator. Thanks for listening.